Our session is dedicated on solutions and new instruments. It was what we discussed a lot 2 weeks ago at the annual meetings of the IMF and the World Bank, and with many different meetings around that, notably the G20 finance meetings and the task force for climate, the joint Sherpa finance group. And we discussed a lot about 2 weeks ago about the financing gap to help emerging and developing countries addressing their development and climate needs for adaptation, for mitigation. And the role of multilateral development banks, the role of their financial instruments, and how to mobilize private finance at scale. We had some discussion about what the World Bank Group can do, what other MDBs, notably African Development Bank and with the Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa, and also joint initiative for electricity in Africa together with the World Bank. The key message, the key question was about mobilizing private finance at scale. How to do that? To discuss about the solutions and the bottlenecks, what to do to do it better. We have a great panel here, and I will immediately start with Boitumelo MASHILO, Chief Director at the Government Technical Advisory Center of the South African Treasury. Boitumelo, I give you directly the floor because I started with the G20, and it's an opportunity for you to tell us how do you see the G20 South African presidency in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, colleagues. Firstly, South Africa is quite privileged to be in this position to host the G20, starting on the 1st of December 2024. And as the fourth consecutive emerging economy or developing country to host the G20, we will be advancing a developmental agenda, and we are the only African country to be in the G20. So we will have a bit of focus around Africa and the influence thereof. Part of our presidency will be focusing on three broad issues from an infrastructure perspective, and I think some of it has to do with what you have spoken about. And the first one is about developing an investable pipeline in an environment where the fiscal environment of many developing countries are quite constrained. The need to partner with the private sector is inevitable. And in that regard, two things are important. The first one is having a credible pipeline, and one that is transparent. And secondly, it's about having an enabling environment. And in this priority, we are working with the likes of Sustainable Infrastructure Foundation, represented by Christophe on the panel. And it's really about, one, the systematic data collection, so that we have timely, relevant data that, we can use for attracting private sector participation. Two, it's about, implementing sound planning and preparation practices. And thirdly, it's really about the ability to be able to do data analytics and, manage or oversee the performance of assets. So that's sort of the one area that we are targeting. The second one is about developing cross-border infrastructure. Again, coming from the sub-Saharan Africa, this is a priority that we are continuing from the Brazilian presidency. It's about regional integration. It's about prosperity of the regions and the economy, the continent in general, the free movement of people, and so on and so forth. And the third area that we are looking into is really about the scaling up of sustainable infrastructure through blended finance approaches. And from the previous discussion, again, there was a question around the blended finance mechanisms and approaches, and that's one of the areas that we want to advance. Maybe let me stop here for now.
Thank you very much, Boitumelo. So you've made perfectly the transition for the first question I have for the first round of discussion, which is what are the solutions which have been implemented recently, and how do you see how it works? For that, we will start with Tom Suster from IFC World Bank Group. So what are the products which for you are key for having a private finance at scale for infrastructure projects?
Thank you, William. So I'm in Treasury at IFC. So as you know, the private sector arm of the World Bank. Treasury is also responsible for mobilization, and a lot have been talked about G20 capital adequacy framework review of the MDB community. One of the outcomes was mobilizing the private sector. I'm sure you've seen a lot of numbers being thrown around. 4 trillion over the next 5 years until 2030 in emerging markets to invest in sustainable development goals, while there is 400 trillion of private money out there. So how do we reach these investors? And there are subsets that are particularly interested for this kind of investor, the impact investors, sustainable development goals. As you know, impact investors, insurance companies, long-term assets with stable income, another one. Local banks that can recycle, and the previous panel talked about local currency and the importance of it, but local banks that can recycle savings once these economies start to develop. How do you recycle that and convert that into long-term investment? So we're working on mobilization a lot. IFC has been on the forefront. I meet a lot of you guys that have been co-investing with IFC, but that, for the last couple of years, we come to a ratio of 1 to 1. We invest $1 of our own balance sheet, and we bring in the private sector for another $1. And we are by far one of the most successful MDBs to do so. So that's clearly not enough to get to that 4 trillion, or not even close. So we're looking to instruments to get to that 1 to 10, 1 to 15, 1 to 20. It sounds ambitious, but that's what we're working towards. One of the products, what we're trying to do is develop a new asset class. It's kind of a CLO for emerging markets, where in the long run, we would just hold a sliver of 5% on all the different tranches, whether it be the senior tranche, the mezzanine tranche, or the junior tranche. So if we originate 100 million and keep 5 million throughout those three structures, you come to 1 to 19, if you make the math correctly. So to that extent, we've been working for a year on that, hired BlackRock as a financial advisor, look at the market, put it up as a new product, and we are looking to issue kind of a trial by the end of this year, so that we can roll it out, and down the road, hopefully, you open this platform up for other MDBs, because then the challenge is really origination and not longer mobilization. Another thing that was mentioned before is how to crowd in the private sector, is opening up the our credit data. Francois and I were on a panel last year. We talked about it. Well, it's done. This was one of the recommendations. 2 weeks ago, we published the new report with all the recovery data, as much detail as we can go. Some of the levels don't have relevant data anymore, because they're per sector, per country, and per income level of countries. Sometimes we don't have enough relevant data anymore to publish a meaningful number. So that is done. And we actually have a session on Wednesday. I'm afraid it's full, but anyway, we'll have a detailed session where Frank will give you the more detail. And the outcome is that, yes, it's not as risky as people think. And this is the message that we need to bring to the investment community, the rating agencies and the bank regulators also, such that there's not an overcharging from a capital perspective. and then the pricing will follow. And I'm going to stop here on those two things.
Thank you very much, Tom. A lot of things which resonate with the recently endorsed MDB roadmap within the G20. It's where you talked about different actions which will be monitored carefully by the G20 in order to maintain the pressure for all these elements. I move to Christophe Dossard. You were already mentioned by Boitumelo. Could you tell us from your activity source, how do you see this instrument as a leverage for mobilizing private finance?
Yeah, thank you, William. I will put myself in the position of the governments, so I will focus on data origination. It was mentioned by Tom. What we have been seeing is that first source is managed by the multilateral development banks. So my bosses are the Asian Development Bank, EBRD, EIB, Inter-American Development Bank, IFC, and the World Bank. We came together in order to see how could we empower governments so that they are in a position to be able to prioritize and select more easily projects. There are different tools that exist, the prioritization tool at the World Bank, but one aspect that is very key is how can you be in a position to prioritize project if you are not able to collect all the information that you have in different ministries and different agencies. And that is something that we have seen. We're working with 50 countries, and it's very difficult to see one standardized approach inside a country because different ministries, they like to work in silos. Sometimes they don't share the information, and it's very difficult to have one global view of what's going on. And if we want to be able to create pipeline of investable project, as Boitumelo was mentioning, and how they have also identified the issue, is systematic data collection. But the systematic data collection has to be also customized at the country level. We talk about that regularly at the G20. The one-size-fits-all doesn't work. So there is a position that we took with the MDBs is let's empower government with a digital solution. So it's basically a software in order for them to be able to customize it with their own processes and regulatory framework. It is being implemented in Brazil, Indonesia, South Africa, even France, Canada. We are about to start. And there are many other countries that are also implementing it. The feedback that we are getting in order to look at also the subject of the panel is that in order to get to decarbonization, the governments need to see what's going on. And the feedback that we're getting from the governments is, once I can collect the information from my different ministries and agencies, then I have clarity on what is going on inside. But also what we had to do is not only to customize it at the country level, but also to adapt it to the international best practices. There are different methodologies that are created, such as the QII indicators and the principles that we have included, but the fast infra label as well, the Blue Dot Network, UNECE peers, SMI project development tool. There are different initiatives and methodologies that are being created. When I look at the governments and they have to look at all of those different methodologies, and sometimes they are asked, can you please fill out this one, can you please fill out that one, it's important to be able to facilitate the work of those different project officers. Sometimes the capacity is limited, they don't have a lot of resources, they're working with different internet connections, and also they are not a lot, and they are crazy, they are working like crazy. And Boitumelo, for example, I know that he works around 4 a.m. and he's always inspiring me that he spent that much of time to prepare those projects. The point is, how do we make it easy? So we had to develop this digital solution for governments, customized at the country level, but also with the international best practices. That will be it for the moment.
Thank you very much, Christophe. David SYED, you are partner at Dentons. In your activity, what are for you the instruments, the solutions which are impactful and efficient?
Thank you, William. Sorry. No, I think everything that has been said is extremely relevant. And what I'd like to just discuss today is bringing the capital markets, because at the end of the day, all of these instruments require as much liquidity as possible. And the capital markets actually provide that. Now, in many, many countries, there's different levels of, let's say, financial sophistication and different levels of access to markets. So everything I'm going to say is predicated on the fact that you need to go through probably data collection, project preparation, all of the different stages, let's say, that have been mentioned today in this panel and in the previous panel, actually. But at the end of the day, if we can actually harness and focus and drive the capital markets to be able to finance the decarbonization needs of the emerging markets, that will be, I think, a very effective solution. It doesn't in any way preclude other forms of financing, and actually can be combined with those. But I do think the capital markets do need to be tapped into much more largely. I'll give you an example, just as I think an interesting kind of data point on a deal that we worked on 2 years ago. It took about 1.5 years to complete, and probably a bit more if you look at the preparatory work, which was the Ecuador blue bond, right? We advised my team, the sovereign team, advised the government of Ecuador, and it was basically a bond buyback. Now, in many ways, that's an example of a country that had already accessed the capital markets, right? So, and it had a relatively high cost of financing, and there was a good discount on the buyback. So there was many advantages to that deal that go well beyond, I would say, the simple environmental impact of the transaction. But there was also a very significant environmental impact in the sense that it financed a blue, let's say, a conservation of the Galapagos region, which is, of course, is a treasure for humanity. So that's the whole kind of green bond, blue bond, etc. world, I think, can be seriously and significantly augmented, in my opinion. So just another instrument.
Thank you very much, David. I propose to launch the second and last round of discussion. We talked about the solutions based on your experience, and also based on your experience, what are the obstacles, bottlenecks, impediments? What could be done better, differently, in order to be at scale? Not one size fits all, but at the end, if we are not at scale, we don't address the issue. So what are for you, if you could change something, even beyond what is beyond your control, what would you do? I could start with Tom.
Yeah, well, I hope we're at the World Bank Group, we're trying to change a lot of these things. And to that effect, I think it was mentioned before, as part of this G20 review, there was a panel of public sector players, large CEOs of large firms, BlackRock and so on, and they had certain recommendations. And one of the recommendations for them, I think Christophe alluded to that as chaos sometimes. But on our side, people could buy guarantees for some certain risks they could not take on, whether it be political risk, credit risk, or other kinds of risk. And sometimes they had to go to IFC, sometimes they had to go to the World Bank, sometimes to our insurance arm, MIGA. So that's all been centralized under one umbrella of MIGA. And that's where private investors might find impediments or obstacles to invest in emerging markets. They can look at one quote-unquote menu and see which of the risks they rather not take on. And I talked about political risks, whether it's convertibility, appropriation risk. I'm sure you all know them, but all of that is being offered. Same on the credit guarantee side and solutions for trade finance, where if you are not certain or you can't take a full risk on the underlying import-export bank or the local state agency that insures your trade finance locally, you can go to MIGA and as a one-stop shopping. That's one of these solutions that was put in place since the 1st of July of this year. So.
Thank you, Tom. Christophe, same question for you.
Yeah. Well, implementing a software with governments, it seems easy, but it's really difficult because you're going to have different laws. For example, data localization. Sometimes they need to have the data in the country, but then there is a big hype in terms of AI. And AI in the infrastructure space is quite interesting regarding the lack of data there is. But if we want to leverage the AI benefits, there is a need for, again, systematic data collection, and also there is a need for cloud solutions. I don't want to be too technical, but if a country wants to have its own servers without connecting to the cloud, using AI technology will be almost impossible because it's too expensive. The other impediments that we see is about cybersecurity. Something that we don't talk a lot, but we address it a bit at the G20 is that most of the countries where we are working, sometimes they have their own solutions with local companies and local servers. But some countries, they get hacked because the security is not adequate and the cybersecurity expert is very expensive. So when I look at that from that perspective, what we had to do in order to address those issues is to develop our own solution on the cloud, but under the United Nations jurisdiction in order to guarantee data immunity and data sovereignty to the users. But plus, to be able, flexible enough to have data localization in their country. And when we look at all of these solutions, impediments, for example, the presidency of Brazil, they spent 10 months in order to go through the approval of using source at the presidency level, but we did it. But the point is, and to finish, is that what we see now in terms of going through these impediments and getting better, talking about the infrascope and data collection in Ecuador, Ecuador was in 2022, they were 15th in the infrascope. It's the Economist Impact and the Inter-American Development Bank ranking. And they went just 2 weeks ago to the 9th position, and it was announced during the World Bank IMF annual meetings that William was referring to. And one of the reasons is source. And that's why we can see also by going through the impediments and taking the time with government, and thanks to the MDBs and the donors, also like France and Switzerland and Germany, we can make it happen. But yeah, those impediments are always a reality in the countries, and we just need patience and time in order to do it. Thank you.
Merci, Christophe. David, which impediment would you like to mention?
I'll mention two. I mean, there's many, obviously, so and some have been mentioned. I'll mention two. One is standardization of the monitoring of, for example, these green bonds and blue bonds, because a lot of work is done up front, but the question is, how do you monitor it over time? These bonds are long-term instruments and they need to be monitored. And how do you standardize that so whatever the information that's going to the markets is actually coherent and consistent across the different countries and jurisdictions using these instruments? So I'd say that's one. Obviously, in the financial markets, on financial parameters, we have Standard & Poor's, Moody's, we have the rating agencies. But I think in the more environmental and sustainability indexes, it's a more complex. So I think that's one area to work on. And I know there's lots of work being done. I'm not saying there's not a lot of work being done, but it's still, I think, a work in progress. So that's one. The second one I would say is regional issues. Again, taking Ecuador, but then expanding to green bonds in the Amazon basin, which I think is another very important area that we want to focus on in terms of preserving the Amazon. That's an issue that would actually bring at least 4 or 5 countries together. And how do you actually then put that into a framework which actually can issue financing or receive financing, and what sort of guarantee package and what sort of support can each country give, and is it joint several or is it several, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of issues on a regional basis, which I think also need to be addressed. So, thank you.
Merci beaucoup, David. Thank you, David. Boitumelo, the last words for you. So you started with the G20 South African presidency. You had also, as a country, the experience of the Just Energy Transition Partnership. What do you think could change, perhaps thanks to your G20 presidency next year? Which impediment would you like to alleviate, to remove?
I think in less than a minute, 2. And the one is related to the issue of origination. And this has to do with the limited capacity and capability that a lot of governments sit with. And I think, with one of our priorities being about developing an investable pipeline, a lot of work has to go into capacitating these governments in order to translate the high-level objectives and plans that countries want to achieve into implementable projects that can be financed at some point. So that's the one area. The other one is really about the optimal financing mix that we sometimes see. One of the things that we've realized is that, firstly, to deal with decarbonization does not only require money, and origination is a good example of that. But the other one is, even in the case of money, you do need a good mix of senior debt, concessional loans, grants, and so on and so forth. And one of the things that we have seen through the JET partnership program that we've been doing as South Africa is that if you don't necessarily have the right mix, you will still find it difficult to sort of get the traction that you need. Let me stop here in the interest of time.
Perfect. We are exactly on time. I'm just checking if we can take one or two questions. No? Okay. So we are on time. Thank you so much.